Imagine you're looking at a patient's medical chart,
Okay.
and the doctor points to an X-ray, taps the glass, and says, "Look at this. The patient has grown 7 times stronger in the last 20 years. Absolute miracle."
Right. Sounds like great news.
Exactly. But then you look closer. You step past the doctor, you look at the actual structural imaging, and you realize, wait a second, the patient is suffocating under twice as much weight as they can physically carry.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So you have to ask yourself, how can someone grow 7 times in size, but, end up functionally weaker?
I mean, it completely breaks our standard models of how growth is supposed to work. We're conditioned to believe that if a primary number goes up, everything else just naturally follows.
Right. The whole rising tide lifts all boats thing.
Mhm.
Wealth trickles down, infrastructure gets built, the nation prospers.
Exactly.
And that contradiction is exactly why we're here today. Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Thanks for having me back.
Of course. Today, we are diagnosing what I think is the ultimate economic paradox. You, our listener, have brought us a genuinely fascinating, incredibly dense stack of data.
It is a massive amount of information.
It really is. It's a comprehensive 15-page research outline titled The Paradox of Growth and the Pains of Transition. And it covers the years 1960 to 2022.
Right.
So our mission for this deep dive is to take this data and figure out what is really going on under the hood of a nation that is blessed with truly unbelievable natural resource wealth.
But somehow they find themselves trapped in this vicious cycle.
Yeah, a cycle of high growth, high debt, and high dependency. We are, of course, talking about Zambia.
And just to ground this before we get too deep into the weeds, we're going to be looking at this through 3 distinct lenses today.
Okay, lay them out for us.
So we have the economic, the social, and the environmental. Because as the data stack you provided makes very clear, you cannot isolate these things.
Right.
The environmental cost of mining directly affects the social reality of the farmers, which, ultimately affects the economic reality of the government's debt. It's a really tightly woven knot.
And to give you listening a sense of just how tight that knot is, I want to start with the core hook you highlighted in the data. If you picture a line chart in your head right now.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
On the left side, you have Zambia's local currency GDP. From the year 2000 to 2022, this line goes on an absolute tear. I mean, it is a massive, relentless, sevenfold bull run.
It looks like a textbook economic miracle on paper.
It does. But then you mentally overlay the external debt chart right on top of it.
Right.
And that debt line is exploding at double the pace. It literally skyrockets from roughly $1 billion to over $23.3 billion in that exact same time frame.
It's staggering when you look at it visually.
Okay, so let's unpack this. How does an economy multiply its total size by 7, but somehow end up drowning in twice as much debt relative to that massive growth? If the pie is getting 7 times bigger, why is the government borrowing like they're broke?
Well, that is the multi-billion-dollar question, isn't it?
Literally.
Yeah. To figure it out, we have to look past the illusion of that GDP growth. We have to figure out if this is just a failure of monetary policy at the central bank, or if it's the exhaustion of what economists call the copper dividend.
Right.
Or, and I think the data leans heavily this way, is it something much deeper, woven into the very structural architecture of how the economy was built from the ground up?
I think to understand the debt and really to understand the economy, we first have to understand the physical reality of the nation itself. Like, who are we talking about here? What is the baseline?
Let's establish that baseline. So by the end of this data timeline in 2022, Zambia's population reached roughly 20 million people.
Wow.
Now, from a geographic standpoint, the population density is sitting at about 26.4 people per square kilometer.
So to put that in perspective for you listening, that is a relatively spacious country. There's physical room to move around.
Yeah, exactly. It's not a hyper-dense megastate where everyone is just stacked on top of each other.
Right.
Physically, there is room, but economically, the space is incredibly claustrophobic.
What do you mean by that?
Well, it's because of what drives the entire national engine. This is a textbook, classic resource exporting economy. Mineral rents are the absolute lifeblood of the nation.
Okay, mineral rents.
Yeah, when we look at the historical data, there are periods where mineral rents peaked at over 30% of the entire gross domestic product.
Wait, I want to make sure I'm wrapping my head around that term before we move on.
Okay.
When you say mineral rents, what exactly is the mechanism there?
It's a really crucial distinction in economics.
Right, so how does a copper mine functioning in the country translate into a rent that affects the GDP?
So economic rent in this specific context is the difference between the value of the mineral copper, primarily, in Zambia's case, when it's sold on the global market, and the actual cost of extracting it from the ground.
Okay, I follow.
So if it costs you, let's say, $2,000 to dig up a ton of copper, and the global market pays you $8,000 for it, that $6,000 difference is the mineral rent.
Oh.
And the government tries to capture as much of that rent as possible through a complex web of corporate taxes, export duties, and mineral royalties.
So when you say mineral rents made up 30% of the GDP, you're saying that 30% of everything produced and earned in the entire country came just from the sheer surplus value of pulling rocks out of the ground and selling them overseas.
Precisely. It is an immense concentration of wealth generation in one single sector.
Wow.
Now let's look at the long view of this growth, stretching from 1960 all the way to 2022.
Let's do it.
In 1960, the GDP was around $3.75 billion. And we're adjusting this for 2015 constant dollars just so, inflation doesn't distort the picture.
Right, keep it apples to apples.
Exactly. So by 2022, that number hit roughly $24 billion.
So over a 60-year timeline, the line definitively goes up. The economy expanded massively.
It expanded, yeah, but the path it took to get there was a violent roller coaster.
The volatility.
Right. The data shows us years where the economy is absolutely surging, clocking in over 10% annual growth.
Which is huge.
It is. But then you look at the 1990s, and the timeline is just peppered with severe repeated negative growth. Actual economic contractions.
Ouch.
And even recently, post-2015, the entire growth center shifted downwards, capping off with a 2.8% contraction in 2020.
Obviously, 2020 was heavily driven by global pandemic conditions, which shocked everyone.
Sure, absolutely.
But those 1990s contractions and the sheer variance between a 10% boom year and a negative growth year, I'm trying to deduce why that matters so much.
It mattered immensely.
But if the GDP ultimately grew from $3.75 billion to $24 billion, shouldn't the country be getting inherently wealthier regardless?
You'd think so.
But I mean, if I invest in the stock market, it bounces up and down every day. But as long as my retirement account is bigger in 30 years, I don't really care about the daily volatility.
Right.
So why is national economic volatility so dangerous if the line ultimately goes up?
That's a very common assumption, comparing a national economy to a passive stock portfolio. But what's fascinating here is that the math of nation building breaks down completely under those conditions.
How so?
Volatility doesn't just make the charts look messy, it actively destroys long-term capital accumulation.
Okay, what's the actual mechanism there?
Think about what it takes to build a developed nation. You need generational infrastructure.
Like roads and bridges?
Yes, you need a high-voltage national power grid, deep water ports, rail links to ports for Zambia since it's landlocked high-speed rail networks, and a world-class university system.
Massive projects.
Massive. And these projects take 10, 20, sometimes 30 years of consistent, predictable funding.
Right. You can't pause a hydroelectric dam halfway through construction just because the budget ran dry for a year.
Exactly. Or, you can pause it, but the concrete degrades, the contractors leave, and when you try to restart 5 years later, it costs twice as much.
That makes total sense.
So when a national economy is highly volatile, the government cannot plan a 20-year infrastructure pipeline. Because every time they experience one of those negative growth years, like the severe contractions in the 90s, tax revenues collapse.
And suddenly the government is scrambling.
Exactly. They have to divert whatever capital they do have away from long-term building and pour it into emergency patching just to keep the hospitals open and the police paid.
Wow.
You're perpetually stuck in survival and recovery mode. You never actually get to shift into long-term expansion mode.
So for you listening, imagine trying to plan your household budget or trying to save for your kids' college fund if your salary wasn't predictable.
It would be a nightmare.
Right. Imagine if your income randomly fluctuated between a massive 10% bonus one year and then a 5% pay cut the next year, over and over again for decades.
You couldn't plan anything.
Exactly. You wouldn't sign a mortgage for a better house. You wouldn't invest in a small business. You'd be terrified. You would just hoard cash during the good years. Or, more likely, you'd have to take out high-interest personal loans to survive the bad years.
And that psychological and financial paralysis is exactly what happens on a macro scale. And it brings us to the most urgent question. Why is Zambia's growth so violently volatile?
Well, looking at the data stack, it all points back to that one massive anchor we mentioned. Copper.
Yes, the copper anchor. This introduces a concept that is absolutely fundamental to this deep dive, The resource curse.
Sometimes called the paradox of plenty, right?
Exactly.
It seems so counterintuitive, though. If you find a mountain of valuable metal in your backyard, you should be rich. Why is it a curse?
Because it warps the entire incentive structure of a nation. In the late 2000s, as we mentioned, mineral rents repeatedly broke the 15% GDP mark.
Yeah.
Because the economy is so heavy with this one export, it's essentially strapped to the front of the global commodity cycle. It has no steering wheel.
So they are totally at the mercy of outside forces.
Completely. If the global market, say the construction sector in China or the EV market in Europe, suddenly demands copper, the price spikes, and Zambia experiences a massive boom, money floods in.
But when the global market cools off, or when a new technology reduces the need for copper, the price crashes.
And Zambia busts. Hard. Because there is almost zero internal economic diversification to cushion the fall.
Right.
They haven't built a massive agricultural export market or a high-tech manufacturing base to balance the books when copper is down.
But the sources reveal something even more insidious than just market volatility.
Oh, definitely.
There is a hidden cost to this reliance on copper that doesn't show up when politicians are cheering about GDP growth.
Yeah.
And this blew my mind when I read it.
The depletion data.
Yes. The literal depletion of the mineral resources causes a massive negative correction to the national income. The data shows that in the year 2021 alone, resource depletion cost the economy roughly $700 million.
Yes. The concept here is adjusted net national savings. It's a much more honest metric than raw GDP.
How does that work?
Well, when a mining company pulls a ton of copper out of the ground and exports it, the GDP goes up, everyone celebrates. But your national wealth, the actual physical stock of natural assets your country possesses, just went down.
Because that copper is gone forever.
Exactly. It takes millions of years to form, and you just sold it.
It's like selling the copper wiring out of the walls of your own house to pay for a lavish dinner.
That's a great way to put it.
Right. Sure, your cash flow for the evening looks fantastic, but your house is fundamentally worth less the next morning.
That is a perfect analogy. That $700 million in 2021 isn't just a statistical quirk. It represents permanent, unrecoverable national wealth that has been liquidated.
Wow.
If you don't take the cash from that liquidated asset and immediately invest it into a renewable asset like human education or long-term infrastructure, you are permanently impoverishing the future of the nation.
And what's terrifying is that while the country has been clinging to this copper anchor, the data shows that the actual industrial base of the nation has been shrinking.
Yes, the deindustrialization trend.
Right. The data points to a serious trend of deindustrialization. Industry, which includes construction and manufacturing, fell from a historical peak of over 40% of GDP down to about 35%.
It's a very clear decline.
But why does a country that is pulling billions of dollars of minerals out of the ground suddenly stop manufacturing things?
This is the second half of the resource curse, a specific mechanism known as Dutch disease.
Okay, I've heard that term thrown around. Can we really unpack the mechanics of that? How does finding copper kill a local shoe factory?
Let's walk through it step by step because it's fascinating. Imagine you own a mid-sized factory in Zambia producing textiles. Shirts, pants, basic garments.
Okay, I'm a factory owner.
You buy local cotton, you pay local workers in the local currency, the kwacha, and you sell those shirts both domestically and maybe export them to neighboring countries. You're doing well.
Sounds like a solid business.
But then the global price of copper skyrockets.
Okay, so the mining companies are suddenly making a killing.
Right. And those mining companies are selling their copper on the global market, which means they are being paid in US dollars. Billions of US dollars suddenly come flooding into the Zambian economy.
Okay, so there's a ton of foreign currency.
Exactly. Now, the mining companies need to pay their local taxes, their local workers, and their local suppliers, so they take those billions of US dollars and trade them in for local kwacha.
Okay, so the demand for the kwacha shoots up.
Exactly. Basic supply and demand. Because so many people are buying kwacha with dollars, the value of the kwacha appreciates massively on the foreign exchange market. Suddenly, your local currency is very, very strong.
Which, I mean, that sounds like a good thing. If my currency is strong, I feel richer.
It feels great if you were a consumer buying imported goods, but remember, you are the factory owner making shirts.
Oh.
Because the kwacha is suddenly so strong, your locally made shirts are now incredibly expensive for anyone outside the country to buy. Your export market collapses overnight.
Oh, wow. I see. Because my prices didn't change locally, but the currency conversion makes them super expensive abroad.
Exactly. And it gets worse. Because the kwacha is so strong, foreign-made goods are suddenly dirt cheap to import.
So a massive shipment of cheap imported shirts from overseas floods the local Zambian market.
Yes. And they're priced far lower than what it costs you to make your shirts locally. Your domestic customers stop buying from you. You can't compete with the artificially cheap imports, so you go bankrupt. The factory closes, the workers are laid off.
That is brutal.
That is Dutch disease. The massive influx of foreign currency from one booming resource sector inadvertently destroys the competitiveness of every other industry in the nation.
So the industrial base shrinks from 40% to 35%. And the people who used to work in those factories have to go somewhere.
Right, they need to survive.
And the data shows that the economic weight shifted massively into the service sector. Services have risen to dominate the economy, taking up over 57% of the GDP by 2022.
And this is where we need to be very careful with how we interpret economic terminology.
Right, because normally when you read a high school economics textbook, a shift from manufacturing to a service-based economy is framed as the ultimate hallmark of a developed, modernized nation.
Exactly. You think of Silicon Valley or Wall Street.
Yeah, you look at the United States or the UK, and they are heavily service-based economies. Here's where it gets really interesting. Isn't a 57% service sector a good thing? It sounds like they are modernizing.
It sounds wonderful until you look at the specific type of services making up that 57%.
Okay.
In a fully developed economy, a high-value service sector means high-tech finance, cloud computing, global software as a service, advanced legal consulting. Those are exportable services that generate massive wealth.
Right.
But that is not what's happening here. The data characterizes this as hollow services.
Hollow services. Walk me through the reality of that. If I'm one of those laid-off factory workers, what am I doing in the hollow service sector?
You are likely participating in the informal economy just to survive. Think of a day in the life. You wake up, you use whatever small capital you have to buy a massive multi-pack of imported soap or cooking oil from a wholesaler.
Okay.
You then spend the next 12 hours standing by a busy intersection in the capital city of Lusaka, breaking that multi-pack down and selling individual bars of soap or small sachets of oil to commuters for a fraction of theirs in profit.
Wow.
Or you're engaged in basic domestic labor or driving an informal shared taxi. It's highly labor-intensive, the margins are razor-thin, and crucially, it produces absolutely nothing that can be exported to bring new wealth into the country.
So it's pure survival. It's people circulating the exact same limited pool of local money back and forth between each other without actually generating new economic value.
Exactly.
The report actually defines the economy perfectly. It has inflated services, weak industry, and low-efficiency agriculture.
Yes, and we really must highlight that agricultural piece, because the numbers here represent a profound structural trap.
The agriculture numbers are wild.
Agriculture remains stubbornly stuck at around 10% of the GDP.
Which seems tiny. But the workforce data is the gut punch. That tiny 10% sector employs roughly 55% of the entire national workforce.
It's an absolute tragedy of productivity. Let that sink in for a moment. You have 55% of the working population toiling in the fields every single day, over half the country.
Yeah.
And together, all of their combined labor is only generating 10% of the national wealth.
If I deduce the reality from those numbers,
Yeah.
that means there is virtually no commercial mechanized farming.
Very little, comparatively.
There are no massive fleets of GPS-guided tractors or automated irrigation systems. If it takes half the country to grow 10% of the wealth, that means millions of people are out there with hand tools, praying for rain, just trying to grow enough maize to feed their own families for the year.
Subsistence farming.
Entirely.
It is unmechanized, incredibly vulnerable to weather shocks, and yields barely enough surplus to sell at the market. So you have extreme concentrated wealth extraction happening in the highly mechanized copper mines on one side of the country,
Right.
and sprawling, low-yield survival agriculture on the other, with a hollow, informal service sector trapped in the middle.
And this structural imbalance, the shrinking industry, the wealth permanently leaking out through resource depletion, the hollow services, and the inefficient agriculture, it creates a massive fiscal black hole for the government.
Massive.
Because the government still has a job to do. They have to provide services, build roads, maintain a military, keep the nation functioning.
Exactly.
But with the industrial tax base shrinking and the agricultural sector barely surviving,
Right.
how does the state make up the revenue shortfall?
They do what any desperate entity does. They borrow.
Which brings us to the third major theme of your data stack, the fiscal squeeze, the debt explosion. And this part of the timeline is fascinating because it actually starts with a moment of incredible hope. Let's look at the early 2000s. In 2005, there was a major international debt relief initiative.
Yes, the Heavily Indebted Poor Countries Initiative, or HIPC, spearheaded by the IMF and the World Bank. It was designed to wipe the slate clean for nations that were suffocating under historical debt.
And it worked, temporarily. The data shows it brought Zambia's external debt down to a highly manageable low. They were given a second chance.
The completely clean slate.
But instead of using that clean slate to fundamentally restructure the economy, the debt fiercely rebounded. It didn't just walk up, it sprinted.
It really did.
It skyrocketed to a historic peak of $23.3 billion by the year 2022. That is the red line aggressively crossing the GDP chart we talked about at the beginning. How did they accumulate $23 billion in debt so quickly? Who was lending them this money?
The landscape of global debt changed dramatically in the 2010s. After the 2008 financial crisis, interest rates in the U.S. and Europe dropped to near zero.
Right, money was basically free.
Global investors were desperate for yield. So developing nations like Zambia were suddenly able to issue what are called Eurobond sovereign debt, issued in U.S. dollars and sold to private international investors.
So they went to the global bond market.
Yes. And simultaneously, they took on massive bilateral loans from countries like China, specifically designed to fund massive infrastructure projects, airports, highways, stadiums.
Okay, I see.
The logic was, borrow cheap money now, build the infrastructure, and the resulting economic growth will easily pay off the debt.
But the infrastructure didn't generate enough return.
No, it didn't.
And the debt wasn't in their local currency. If they borrowed in U.S. dollars, they have to pay it back in U.S. dollars.
Exactly. And remember, debt is not a passive number sitting on a ledger. It's a living, breathing thing that demands to be fed constantly. It must be serviced.
The feeding schedule shown in the data is brutal. Debt service payments, just the required interest and the minimum principal payments, violently surged to $3.9 billion in the year 2022 alone.
Almost $4 billion.
Just to keep the creditors at bay for 1 year cost them nearly $4 billion.
To put the weight of that into perspective, look at the fiscal deficit data. Net government borrowing hit an absolute peak of 43.6 billion local kwacha in 2020.
Unbelievable.
When you have debt interest payments taking up that massive of a percentage of your national revenue, the effect is complete suffocation. It absolutely destroys any fiscal space for actual human development.
So what does this all mean? It's the ultimate trap. It's like paying a credit card with another credit card while your salary is losing value every day.
That's exactly what it is.
If you are spending $3.9 billion just on interest, you can't build new schools, you can't subsidize fertilizer to modernize that struggling agricultural sector, you can't upgrade the power grid. Every spare dollar the government collects in taxes is immediately wired to a foreign creditor.
It creates a paralyzed state. And the consequences of that paralysis hit the average citizen directly through the twin engines of misery: inflation and currency collapse.
All right, let's look at that inflation data. The data stack highlights the 1990s as a period of deep historical trauma regarding inflation. They experienced hyperinflation of over 100%.
Which is just devastating.
That means the price of food doubled every few months. But even if we look at the recent data, inflation is still hovering at a painful 10 to 20%.
And 10 to 20% inflation isn't an abstract economic concept. It's the active, daily erosion of household consumption.
Right.
It means the money in your pocket buys 20% less food at the end of the year than it did at the beginning.
And it is heavily compounded by the currency collapse. The official exchange rate detailed in the report plummeted from roughly 0.7 kwacha to the US dollar early on in the timeline, all the way down to a staggering 16.9 kwacha to the dollar by 2022.
That currency depreciation is devastating, specifically because of the structure of their trade. The data shows that Zambia's economy is highly open to trade. Trade volume regularly exceeds 60% of GDP, and it actually peaked at a massive 84% in 2021.
But because of that deindustrialization we talked about earlier, the trade is completely lopsided.
Exactly.
They don't manufacture anything. So they are exporting raw copper, and they are forced to import almost all of their finished goods: machinery, vehicles, electronics, clothing, and crucially refined fuel and certain food staples.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you see the true trap. If your currency crashes from 0.7 to 16.9 against the dollar, every single one of those imported goods becomes astronomically more expensive.
So if I'm that guy surviving in the hollow service sector, selling cooking oil on the street in Lusaka,
Yeah.
the cooking oil is imported. It's priced in dollars at the border. When the kwacha crashes, the wholesale price of that oil skyrockets.
Right.
But my customers who are paid in local kwacha haven't gotten a raise. They can't afford the higher price. So my business collapses and I can't feed my family. It's essentially imported poverty.
That is the human reality of a current account deficit. The country is chronically reliant on external capital inflows just to maintain basic consumption.
It's terrifying.
The massive debt isn't the root cause of the country's pain. The debt is a symptom. It's a symptom of a single export model that failed to diversify. When copper prices dip, the government borrows to maintain the illusion of stability. But eventually, the bill comes due, the currency breaks under the pressure, and the purchasing power of the citizens is wiped out.
It's a vicious cycle. And the only way out of a cycle like that is to innovate, right? You have to pivot the economy.
Absolutely.
You have to build that high-tech manufacturing base or transition that 55% of the workforce into a modern, high-yield agricultural sector. But to do that, you need an incredibly innovative, highly skilled, and highly productive workforce.
Which brings us to the fourth dimension of your data stack, the human capital paradox. And this is where the demographic data becomes incredibly urgent.
Urgent is the right word. The demographics here are staggering. Zambia has an extremely young population.
Very young.
The data shows that between 45% and 48% of the entire population is between 0 and 14 years old.
Yeah.
Nearly half the country is under the age of 15.
It's a massive youth bulge. And economically, it creates what is known as a dependency ratio crisis. The ratio outlined here is startling. For every 100 working-age adults in the economy, there are nearly 90 adolescents and children that require support.
Let's really pause on the gravity of that math. 100 to 90.
It's intense.
If you are a working adult in this economy, your wages aren't just supporting you. The collective burden of society, the taxes, the food budget, the housing, the health care, means 100 workers are carrying the dead weight of 90 dependents who cannot yet contribute economically.
Right.
How on earth does a society save money in that scenario?
The harsh reality is they don't, and that is a fatal flaw for economic development. This high dependency ratio crushes national savings and capital accumulation at the household level.
Walk me through the mechanics of that. Why do household savings matter to the macroeconomy?
Think about the life cycle of capital. In a balanced demographic, a 35-year-old worker earns a salary, pays their bills, and takes their surplus cash and deposits it into a local bank account for retirement.
Oh.
The local bank takes those deposits and lends them out to a local entrepreneur who wants to build a new manufacturing plant. That plant creates jobs, which creates more deposits, and the economy grows.
Virtuous cycle of capital.
Exactly. But in Zambia's demographic reality, that 35-year-old worker doesn't have a surplus because they are feeding, clothing, and trying to educate 4 children while simultaneously supporting 2 aging parents.
Right, there's nothing left over.
100% of their income is consumed immediately by basic survival needs. They have nothing to deposit in the bank. Because the banks have no local deposits, they can't lend money to local businesses. The domestic credit market starves.
And that forces the government to go back to borrowing from foreign sources, which feeds right back into the debt crisis we just talked about.
Exactly. It's all connected. And increasingly, the pressure of this massive youth generation is migrating. Urbanization has grown rapidly, from 17% of the population living in cities in 1960 to 45% in 2022.
But because we already established that the industrial sector is shrinking, these aren't people moving from the farm to the city to take high-paying, unionized factory jobs. There are no factories.
No. They are moving into the hollow service sector we discussed. They are moving into informal settlements. The data shows that slum populations remain persistently high.
So you just have a massive young population migrating to cities, desperate for work, but finding only razor-thin survival margins on the streets.
Exactly.
Well, if they can't find industrial jobs, they at least need a world-class education so they can invent the jobs of the future, right?
Yeah.
They need to become software engineers or advanced agronomists.
Yeah, I absolutely do.
So let's look at the education data. And this is where the paradox really hits hard. The adult literacy rate is actually presented as a bright spot. It has impressively climbed past 80%, and gender gaps in literacy are actively closing. It looks like a huge win.
It does look like a win until you read the next line of the data. The source drops an absolute bombshell here. It highlights a severe learning poverty crisis. A massive percentage of students finish primary school without meeting minimum reading standards.
It's wild.
And the structural bottleneck causing this is glaring. The primary school teacher-student ratio is stubbornly stuck above 1 to 40.
I am genuinely shocked by this. I have to push back or at least ask for clarification here.
Sure.
Wait, They fixed the literacy rate. It's over 80%, but kids are leaving primary school without basic reading comprehension. How is that physically possible to be literate, but in learning poverty?
It's the vital tragic difference between quantitative access and qualitative outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
Literacy, in a purely statistical sense for government reporting, often just measures whether a child can decode symbols.
Right.
Can they sound out the letters? Can they sign their own name? If yes, check the box, they are literate.
Okay.
But learning poverty is a much more rigorous, specific metric used by development economists. It measures whether a 10-year-old can read and actually understand a simple, age-appropriate text.
That makes sense.
A child in learning poverty might be able to read the words aloud, they can vocalize the sounds, but if you ask them what the sentence meant, they have no idea. There is no comprehension.
Oh, I understand. It's exactly like hitting a quota on a factory assembly line. You produced 1,000 smartphones today, so the shift manager spreadsheet looks fantastic.
Right.
But when you actually ship them to customers, 80% of the screens are unresponsive and the batteries don't work. The bureaucratic system prioritizes pushing kids through the doors and generating passing statistics over actually ensuring the human brain absorbs the material.
That is exactly what happens. And when you look at the macro context we just established, the mechanics of this failure make perfect, tragic sense.
The dependency ratio.
Exactly. Remember the dependency ratio. When 100 workers have to feed and school 90 kids, the physical school system is completely flooded by sheer numbers. Millions of kids are pouring into the system.
And remember the debt crisis. The government's budget is being eaten alive by $3.9 billion in debt interest payments.
Precisely. Because they're sending $3.9 billion to foreign bondholders, they don't have the budget to hire more teachers, build new classrooms, or print updated textbooks.
So you end up with the reality of that 1:40 ratio.
Or worse.
Yeah.
You have classrooms crammed with 50 or 60 kids sharing 3 outdated, torn textbooks managed by one single exhausted, underpaid teacher.
You can't do interactive comprehension-based learning with 60 kids. You have to do rote memorization. Repeat after me.
Exactly. Choral response. The kids memorize the sound of the text to pass the test, but the deep cognitive human capital required to pivot this nation to a high-tech digital economy simply isn't being built. The foundation is hollow.
And it's not just the educational foundation. The physical human foundation is struggling too. The health data is a mix of incredible resilience and terrifying fragility.
Yes, the health indicators are very complex.
The data shows a solid rebound in life expectancy from the absolute devastation of the 1990s AIDS epidemic. Life expectancy for both men and women is climbing back up, hitting roughly 61 years. That is a hard-fought victory.
It is a victory, but the medical infrastructure supporting that life expectancy is stretched to its absolute breaking point.
The numbers are grim. There are only roughly 0.3 doctors for every 1,000 people.
Less than a third of a doctor per 1,000 citizens.
Hospital beds are incredibly scarce, and total health spending is a mere 5% of GDP.
Which means the system has zero surge capacity.
And they need surge capacity because the data shows an epidemiological transition. 60% of all deaths are still from communicable diseases, malaria, tuberculosis, things that can be caught and spread.
Right.
But simultaneously, non-communicable diseases, the diseases of modernization like heart disease, hypertension, and diabetes, are actively rising.
It's the worst of both worlds. They are fighting a two-front war on public health. They haven't vanquished the infectious diseases of the past, but they are already facing the chronic diseases of the future, all with a fraction of the necessary funding and a severe shortage of medical personnel.
Okay, if the human capital is struggling under the weight of sheer demographic volume, underfunded education, and a fragile health system, what about the physical and digital infrastructure?
That's the next logical place to look.
Can technology be the silver bullet here? We always hear about developing nations leapfrogging old technologies. Can Zambia use the digital economy to jump over these developmental hurdles? Let's dive into the infrastructure and ecological data.
To understand the digital potential, you first have to look at the physical constraint. And the ultimate physical constraint is electricity.
Okay.
The data reveals a shocking trend. Per capita, electricity usage has actually been declining since 2010.
Wait, declining? In the 21st century, how is an economy growing its GDP while using less electricity per person?
It speaks to the extreme inequality of how that GDP is generated. The highly mechanized copper mines consume massive amounts of power, but the average citizen is seeing their access shrink. Energy shortages are a massive structural bottleneck. Zambia relies heavily on hydropower, specifically the massive Kariba Dam. But due to climate patterns and severe droughts, the water levels drop, and the country experiences crippling rolling blackouts. They call it load shedding.
You cannot dream of rapid industrialization or building massive server farms for a high-tech digital economy if you cannot guarantee that the lights will stay on for 24 hours a day. Factories can't run on a grid that shuts down for 12 hours at a time.
Exactly. But this is where your data stack presents a massive, fascinating contradiction. Look at the mobile telecom data.
It is genuinely mind-blowing. Mobile cellular subscriptions went from near absolutely zero in the year 2000 to an explosive 21.15 million subscriptions in 2022.
It's incredible.
That is over 100% penetration. There are mathematically more active cell phone connections than there are human beings in the entire country.
It's one of the most spectacular technological adoption curves in history. It shows that the population is incredibly eager and adaptive. But there is a catch that limits the economic impact of this adoption. Look at the fixed broadband data.
Right. The data calls it a digital island. Despite everyone having a smartphone in their pocket, fixed broadband subscriptions are abysmal. We're talking about 0.5 subscriptions per 100 people.
Just half a person out of 100 has a fixed internet connection.
The contrast is stark.
Yeah.
You have a country where the power grid is failing, but somehow there are more cell phones than people.
Yeah.
I have to ask, though, can't they just build a digital economy strictly on mobile networks? Just bypass the need for fixed broadband entirely. We saw developing nations bypass landline telephones entirely and jump straight to mobile. Can't they do the same for the internet and build a mobile-only tech boom?
This raises an important question, and it's a tempting theory. And mobile networks are indeed revolutionary for certain aspects of life. They're fantastic for informal commerce.
Like mobile money.
Yes, mobile money transfers have revolutionized how people pay for goods at the market or send money to relatives in rural villages. It empowers the individual to participate in basic peer-to-peer communication without needing a bank account.
Right, it makes that hollow service sector we talked about slightly more efficient. You can coordinate your street vending via WhatsApp.
Precisely. It lubricates the survival economy, but it does not create a globally competitive digital economy.
Why not?
Think about what a true high-end digital economy actually requires to generate massive GDP and high-paying export jobs. We are talking about training artificial intelligence models, hosting global software-as-a-service platforms, running complex cloud computing infrastructure, or managing advanced global logistics chains.
Okay, yeah.
Those industries don't run on 4G cell phones. They require massive, uninterrupted, high-speed data pipelines. They require fiber optic cables. And fundamentally, they require incredibly stable, cheap electricity to keep the server farms cool.
Back to the electricity problem.
Exactly. Right now, Zambia is a digital island. The citizens are deeply connected to each other via their phones, but the nation as an industrial entity is severely limited in its capacity to export digital value to the rest of the world.
Meanwhile, as everyone is staring at their phones, engaging in the mobile economy, the physical land around them is paying the ultimate price.
The environmental cost is huge.
Environmental data in this stack is incredibly grim. It shows that forest cover dropped from 63.7% in 1990 to 61% in 2022.
To a casual observer, a 2.7% drop might sound like a rounding error, but in absolute terms, representing thousands of square kilometers of mature forest, it is a massive, accelerating deforestation event.
And it connects perfectly back to the structural flaws we've already diagnosed. Why are the forests disappearing? It's driven by overlogging for fuel and massive agricultural expansion.
Right.
Because remember, 55% of the workforce is trapped in low-efficiency subsistence agriculture. When your farming techniques are unmechanized and low yield, and you have a massive youth population that needs to be fed, the only way to increase your harvest is to clear more land.
The population has no choice. When the formal economy fails to provide high-yield mechanized farming jobs or industrial factory jobs in the cities, the people are forced to push further and further into the forests, cutting down trees for charcoal and clearing marginal fragile land just to grow basic crops.
And the ecological bill for this is terrifying. On top of the deforestation, greenhouse gas emissions, and this is even excluding the emissions from land use changes, have more than doubled.
Doubled.
They went from 10 million tons in 1970 to 12.6 million tons in 2022. As a direct consequence, the data notes that the number of threatened species, birds, mammals, and plants is significantly rising. The overall ecological fragility of the nation is severe.
The environment is essentially subsidizing the inefficiencies of the economy. The land is paying the debt that the formal economy cannot afford.
So we've seen the crushing weight of the $23 billion debt, we've seen the human capital gaps with learning poverty, and we've seen infrastructure divides and the severe ecological toll.
It's a lot to take in.
To fix any of this, to restructure the debt, to fix the schools, to protect the forest, you have to look at the steering wheel. You have to look at the government institutions tasked with solving these crises.
Which brings us to the final major dimension of the data, the governance bottlenecks.
Now, before we dive into this specific data, I want to make a very clear, explicit reminder to you, our listener. What we're about to discuss is based strictly on the Worldwide Governance Indicators, or the WGI framework provided by the World Bank.
Important context.
We are completely impartial here. We're simply reporting the data metrics exactly as they are presented in the source documents you provided. We are not endorsing any political viewpoint. We are not taking sides in any domestic Zambian politics, nor are we making international political judgments. We are just reading the institutional X-ray.
And the WGI X-ray shows some chronic underlying conditions that explain why reform has been so difficult over the decades.
What are the numbers saying?
Well, the metrics are measured on a scale, and the control of corruption score has hovered stubbornly between -0.3 and -0.4. It has consistently failed to break into the top 50th percentile globally.
But beyond just corruption, the data highlights that regulatory quality fluctuates wildly. And from an economic perspective, wild fluctuations in the rules are almost as destructive as bad rules because it creates absolute uncertainty.
Uncertainty is the absolute enemy of capital.
Exactly. If a foreign company wants to bring $1 billion into Zambia to build a high-tech manufacturing facility, which would solve the deindustrialization problem, they need a 20-year horizon.
At least.
They need to know that the tax code, the export tariffs, and the labor laws won't drastically change halfway through construction. When regulatory quality is volatile, foreign direct investment simply goes to a different country. It severely hinders private sector growth.
Furthermore, the WGI data notes that while the country absolutely maintains a strong regional democratic base and holds regular elections, the voice and accountability score remains in negative territory. The overarching conclusion of the data is that general government efficiency and institutional capacity need urgent, systemic improvement if they are going to execute any kind of turnaround.
The research outline you provided does an incredible job of synthesizing this entire sprawling crisis into 3 main chains that are holding the country back, 3 core bottlenecks.
The 3 heads of the Hydra.
Number 1, the debt crisis. Number 2, resource dependency on copper. And number 3, low human capital quality due to learning poverty.
But the report doesn't just diagnose the illness, it provides a roadmap forward. It outlines a strategic 3-part intervention to break these chains.
Let's walk through the strategy. Step 1, debt restructuring. But the data emphasizes this cannot just be a temporary pause or a domestic band-aid.
No, it has to be structural.
It has to be done under a comprehensive international framework to achieve actual long-term sustainability. They have to permanently stop the bleeding of that $3.9 billion in annual debt servicing. They need breathing room.
Step 2, once they have that fiscal breathing room, is industrial diversification.
Getting away from copper.
They must actively, aggressively reduce the sheer weight of copper in their GDP. They need to use government incentives to boost local manufacturing and high-tech services. They essentially need to reverse the Dutch disease.
Right.
They have to transition the workforce out of hollow informal services and into value-added exportable services.
And step 3, which is arguably the hardest but most fundamental, educational transformation.
Yes.
They have to fundamentally shift the bureaucratic focus of the school system. They have to stop measuring success by pure enrollment rates, just getting kids into a room to check a box, and shift entirely to measuring learning outcomes.
That is critical.
They have to defeat learning poverty, lower the teacher-student ratio, and ensure actual comprehension, because those kids are the only ones who can eventually staff the diversified high-tech industries from step 2.
When we synthesize all of this data, the debt, the demographics, the ecology, the reality presented is undeniably difficult. The challenges are monumental. But economically speaking, it is also a coiled spring. Think about the ultimate potential embedded in this data.
I see it. You have this extreme youth demographic, a massive, unstoppable wave of human energy, and you combine it with that 100% mobile internet penetration. They are young, they are hungry, and they are digitally native.
Exactly. If the institutional steering wheel can be stabilized, and if the debt can be successfully restructured, the capital that is freed up must be deployed directly with laser focus into the educational quality of that youth bulge.
Absolutely.
If you can teach them comprehension and if you can stabilize the physical power grid, that massive mobile connected generation possesses the latent power to nurture an entirely new digital economy and finally modernize that struggling agricultural sector.
It's a huge historic if, but the mathematical path to prosperity is clearly visible in the data. Thank you so much for bringing this to us and for taking this intensive journey through the data points of a nation standing at an absolute critical crossroads.
It's a fascinating, deeply complex puzzle. The policy choices made in the next 5 years regarding debt and education will quite literally echo for the next 50 years.
Before we go, I want to leave you, our listener, with one final provocative thought, something to mull over on your own. It wasn't explicitly spelled out in the strategic roadmap, but it is glaringly obvious when you stack these specific data points together.
What are you thinking?
Well, we talked extensively about how 55% of the Zambian workforce survives on inefficient, low-yield subsistence agriculture. And we just talked about the alarming rate of deforestation and the severe ecological fragility of the land.
Right.
Here's the thought experiment. What happens when the reality of global climate change inevitably strains that fragile, inefficient agricultural land beyond its breaking point? When the Kariba Dam runs too low to provide power, and the seasonal rains stop being predictable for those farmers?
That's a scary scenario.
Will that massive, ultra-young, mobile-connected generation be forced to flee the failing rural farms en masse, flooding into the cities to create a totally unprecedented, informal digital economy out of pure, desperate survival?
Yeah.
Or will that mobile boom, the 21 million cell phones, finally be the technological tool that allows them to share data, access microfinancing, and revolutionize how they farm the land before the topsoil is gone forever?
It is the ultimate race between ecological limits and digital potential.
It's a race the whole world should be watching. Thank you for listening.
Thanks for joining us.
We'll catch you on the next Deep Dive.